Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for coming and taking the time for meeting and discussing today. Can I just check if I'm audible to those who want to hear? Thank you very much. Now, thank you for coming, as I say. Thank you also for all those who've done what they've done, especially Linda and Andy, to get me here today. I'm very grateful for that and happy to have the chance to be with you. What I'm going to do this morning is to introduce you to two people whose life and witness and teaching seems to me to say rather more about contemplation and mission than any amount of theory about it. But let me first set the scene just a little by asking what kind of connection we're trying to make here between the life of contemplation and the mission of the Church. And the answer I'd want to propose would begin along these lines. Contemplation is about looking. The Greek word for contemplation, theoria, simply means gazing, gazing intently. And it seems very clear to me that we can't think at all about the mission of the Church without reflecting on how we learn to gaze intently at the world we're in, to gaze intently at other people, to gaze intently at the environment we share. Those who have learned in one way or another to look intently into the mystery of God are learning what we often call a transferable skill. That is the capacity to let go of the fuss and clutter inside in order to look. And it means that wherever those eyes are turned, that are accustomed to looking into the mystery of God, they will turn with something of the same clarity, selflessness, and patience that is given to the task of looking into the mystery of God. So that's the basic bridge I want to take for granted here. The person who learns how to look at God is learning how to look intently at the world they're in and the neighbors they're given. And to a degree, it works the other way around as well. The person who has learned to look intently into the mystery of the neighbor and the mystery of the world is somebody who, at some level, whether they know it or not, is turning their attention towards the mystery of God. That's the theory. But it's a theory which is grounded in the experience of quite a few people. And the two figures I want to talk about this morning lived and worked in roughly the same period and roughly the same area. Most of their lives were spent only a couple of miles apart from each other. As far as I know, they never met and were never aware of one another. But both of them were people with a powerful sense of calling to the life of contemplation and a powerful and very visible commitment to attending to those around them in very practical service. They both spent most of their lives in Paris. One was a Russian Orthodox nun, one was a Roman Catholic laywoman. They're on the whole not all that well known in Britain, and I have to say I regard it as one of my tasks in life to try and introduce more people to these two figures, because I think they have a transformative impact on all those who encounter them. I'm going to speak about them in turn, quote a little bit from their work, and try to draw out how what they say about their own Christian witness and their life of prayer fleshes out these broad, abstract principles about looking, attending, and patience. And so I'll begin with our Russian nun. Elizaveta Pilenko came from a Ukrainian family, quite a well-placed, wealthy, cultured family, living mostly in Russia rather than Ukraine. And she grew up in the late 19th century environment of cultivated Russian radicalism, the Russian intelligentsia. Passionate about poetry, passionate about revolution, passionate about pretty well everything, except probably religion. Elizaveta began to write poetry as a teenager. She began a correspondence with one of the very best-known Russian poets of the age, Alexander Blok. So I should say she'd been born in 1871. And as she matured, and as the horrendous experience of the First World War and the Revolution unfolded around her, she discovered more and more a need to anchor herself in the Orthodox faith that she had earlier abandoned. During the Civil War, she got into quite a lot of trouble. She was the sort of person that trouble follows around assiduously, because she was so difficult to locate on the political map. She was a revolutionary. She also loathed Bolshevism. She spent a very brief period as mayor of a little town in Russia because nobody else was willing to take on the responsibility of administration in a period of such chaos. She was very nearly executed by the revolutionary forces and ended up marrying one of the revolutionary commanders. Eventually, in the early 1920s, along with a very substantial number of other non-Marxist intellectuals in Russia, she was expelled and ended up in Paris. By that time, she'd had 3 children. Her marriage was in deep trouble. She and her husband eventually parted and had a civil divorce and an ecclesiastical divorce later on, which is possible in the Orthodox Church. 2 of the children died, partly as a result of the privations of the Civil War and the experience of exile. Once in Paris, Elizaveta began to involve herself in, first of all, the life of the Russian refugee community. She herself told a story of going to meet a group of Russians, well, of course, thousands and thousands of Russian refugees in Paris at the time, going to meet a group of Russians in a settlement outside Paris, having advertised a discussion group on the novels of Dostoevsky. When she arrived, the people in the refugee camp said, well, we're all very interested in the novels of Dostoevsky, but actually the most important thing for us at the moment is to get this place clean and tidy. And Elizaveta said, fine, and rolled her sleeves up and said, we'll postpone Dostoevsky, we'll do the cleaning. Very typical of her approach. And as she worked more and more with Russian refugees, others were drawn to her, the homeless in Paris and the needy. She, with a group of friends, began to operate an informal soup kitchen for refugees. And her Christian commitment grew steadily deeper and steadily more adventurous. She went to the Russian bishop in Paris and said, to everybody's astonishment, that she thought she probably ought to be a nun. A divorced single mother, heavily engaged in soup kitchens and the like, leading a somewhat bohemian lifestyle, wasn't the obvious candidate for monastic profession. But happily, Mother Maria, as she was to become, insisted. The bishop, to his eternal credit, swallowed hard and said, yes, we'll take the risk. Her spiritual director, the great theologian, Father Sergei Bulgakov, one of the greatest Russian philosophers and theologians of the 20th century said, go ahead. So Elizaveta Pilenko, now Elizaveta Skobtsova, from her marriage, became Mother Maria Skobtsova in 1932. During the 30s, her work developed along the lines I've already indicated. Work with the homeless, with the destitute, with refugees. Her lifestyle didn't change very much in spite of the fact that she was wearing a monastic habit. The Russian bishop in Paris, somewhat naively, sent a couple of well-meaning, pious Russian nuns to live with her, and a very well-meaning, pious Russian priest to be her chaplain. These lasted about 18 months. They weren't terribly impressed by the fact that Mother Maria was liable to sit up all night talking philosophy with somebody, to get up at 5 in the morning to go to the markets to get reject vegetables to use for the soup kitchen, and could occasionally be seen in the cafes of the left bank with a glass of beer in one hand and a gauloise in the other. Not entirely conventional, nunnish behavior. But during the 30s, something else was going on in Europe, and that, of course, was the rise of Nazism. And the refugees arriving in Paris were not, in the 30s, Russians. More and more, they were, of course, Jews. Mother Maria began to work with Jewish refugees, as well as Russian. And when the Germans occupied Paris, this, of course, became a highly dangerous activity. She and her immediate circle, her friends, her chaplain, Father Dmitry Klepenin, her surviving son, one or two other people, made the little house in the Rue de Rommel in Paris a trusted, confidential center for French Jews trying to escape from the Nazis. Father Dmitry Klepenin, the chaplain, blithely issued large numbers of faked baptismal certificates to Jewish people in Paris so that they could brandish them at the German soldiers. When the Jews of Paris were rounded up for deportation and kept in the Ville d'Hiver, the sports stadium on the outskirts of Paris, Mother Maria and Father Dmitry not only visited these Jews in custody regularly, but, this is an astonishing story, but it is true, they managed to smuggle out a significant number of Jewish children in rubbish bins. The symbolism of all that I'd leave to you to work out, but it's an extraordinary story, and as it is true. When the Germans had first arrived in Paris and had imposed German-style legislation in Paris, that of course included the wearing of the yellow star by Jews so they could be publicly identifiable. Mother Maria argued with some of her Russian Orthodox colleagues who said, well, that's very terrible for the Jews, but it's not really our problem, is it? And Mother Maria said, this is actually a Christian problem. If it is a Jewish problem, it is a Christian problem, because we belong together. And she famously said, all Christians should voluntarily wear the yellow star. Gradually, it became obvious to the German authorities what was going on, and Mother Maria and her friends were under suspicion. Father Dmitry was taken in for questioning, and famously, when interrogated about whether he knew any Jews, picked up the crucifix on his chest and said, well, this one for a start. And predictably, he was arrested, murdered in one of the camps. So was Mother Maria's son, and eventually Mother Maria herself was sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she was killed in 1945. According to stories from the camp inmates, she had actually volunteered to go into the execution lines in place of another woman who was so hysterically panicked that she couldn't be restrained. Mother Maria stepped forward and said, well, I'll go instead. In 2004, she was declared a saint by the Patriarchate of Constantinople. And gradually, her work, and she wrote quite a lot in these years, has been published in Russian, and also some of it in French translation, and sadly not very much of it so far in English translation. My own hope is that the publication of a standard Russian edition will speed the translation into French and English of the work that hasn't yet appeared. Because you see, in addition to all this remarkable work that Mother Maria was engaged in, and she was one of those people who seemed to operate on a sort of 28-hour day, she wrote extensively. She wrote poetry, but she also wrote some very dense and complex theological essays trying to explain what she thought she was doing. And while she's a significant enough figure simply as a saint, as an active servant of God, the theology in itself is really fascinating. In the late 1920s, she wrote an essay called Holy Earth, which is essentially about the way in which our Christian identity is always a matter of solidarity with the entire creation. Christ, by becoming human, affirms his solidarity, his identity with the human race. But not only with the human race, he makes holy the entire material creation by himself becoming part of that material creation. And in that identification opens up to us a dimension of our humanity which is always there and always real. The fact that we are deep down sharing the reality, the experience, the vulnerability, and the hope of all other human beings. Our problem is not that we are somehow failing to achieve unity with others. Our problem is that we don't realize the unity we already have with others. Human others and non-human others. And for Mother Maria, this had a great deal to do with her own deep preoccupation with and devotion to the Virgin Mary, very Russian Orthodox theme. Mary becomes, as it were, the first human being to be in absolute total solidarity with Jesus, because the physical life of Mary and Jesus is literally inseparable for 9 months. And Mother Maria says very boldly, that's the level of identity we have with Christ. It's like Mary's solidarity with Christ. It's not feeling, oh, that's very interesting, or I feel very sympathetic to Jesus, or I agree with Jesus. Because in pregnancy, mother and child don't say, I'm very interested in you, I have a lot of sympathy with you, I agree with you. They just live together. Their life is one. Well, says Mother Maria, that's what life in the body of Christ is like. It's that deep, it's that serious, it's that organic. So that paper in 1957 rolls the pitch for a lot of what she's going to say later on about the nature of Christian love. And it's interesting also that in that essay of 1927, she says that all this implies that one way of understanding sin is simply that it's the refusal to relate to or accept the pain of others. Sin is the refusal of the pain of others, she says. Now, she goes on to develop this a great deal in the 30s, and over 10 years after that essay on Holy Earth, she wrote another essay on the second of the great commandments, love your neighbor as yourself. And she says in this essay that one of the problems in Christian ethics is that we take a very narrow and very thin notion of what is involved in love as our ideal. Now, it's very impressive, she says, that people are willing to make sacrifices and to take on the cross of suffering for the sake of others. It's perfectly right, perfectly good that people do this. But, she says, Christian love is actually something more than that, even. It's not just a matter of making a great gesture of sacrificial love. It's recognizing a love that is already alive in you and is just trying to find its way out. And that means, she says, that our love as Christians for one another must, once again, be rather like the love of Mary for Jesus. It sounds strange to say it, but our love for others is a maternal love. The love Christians have for others is a maternal love, in the sense that the life that we have is a life they share, the life they have is a life we share, and our love is rooted in that absolute solidarity, which is beyond all our choices or our preferences or our decisions. It's just there. And we have to get ourselves out of the way and let it happen more fully, more effectively. She had a very interesting and very crisp exchange of views with another of the great figures of the Russian immigration in Paris, the philosopher Nikolai Berdyaev. Berdyaev, who was a major revolutionary thinker, a Christian, but a very radical Christian thinker, Berdyaev wrote a great deal about creativity and the importance of creativity, and was a bit dismissive about, well, specifically about motherhood. He said that the creator, the artist, makes something completely new. A mother simply gives birth to another bit of flesh and blood. Mother Maria took considerable umbrage at that, as well she might have done, and responded, "Nonsense, any fool can be a creative artist." But mothering is actually bringing into being another person. Now, no creator can actually create another person. No human creator can make another person. You can bring stuff out of your head. But the mother brings into being a subject, a center of perception and experience that is not herself. That's mothering. And that, says Mother Maria, that is the love Christians have to exercise, bringing into being, or helping to bring into being, a genuine other, looking at the other person with the kind of intensity that allows them to emerge from their own mysterious depths as a unique image of God. It's a very bold metaphor, you might say, but one that I think both allows for the creative element of Christian love and for that deep sense that our relatedness to one another in the body of Christ and beyond the body of Christ is not simply a matter of attitudes or even of actions, but of a profound, prayerful, serving letting be that draws out the uniqueness of the other person, the other center of reality and experience, of feeling and thought. And so, when we look around our human neighbors, our human world and our non-human world, what we're looking at is a whole range of being that we are invited in Christ to adopt, to parent. Our calling is to be the sort of person who lets the other become, in fullness, what Christ wants them to become. It's a taking responsibility for the other, human and non-human, to become what God intends them to be. And this is the point at which I find Mother Maria stands very close to that very different contemporary of hers, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a great German theologian, also someone who died at the hands of the Nazis. Bonhoeffer speaking about the responsibility of the Christian, the willingness of the Christian to be there for the other in a very profound way as a mark of Christ's own solidarity with, identification with the whole human world. So Mother Maria's approach to love and service in the world, and particularly love and service in the desperate conditions of Paris in the 30s and early 40s, her response is very strongly a fusion of the contemplative and the active, in the sense that she believed with all her being, in spite of her eccentricities, that everything began with the radical opening up of oneself to the reality of Christ incarnate, reconciling, holding together in the depths of our humanity. To look into that and return to that again and again, as she did in the poetry she wrote and the icons she painted and embroidered as well. To look into that, to look into the mystery of Mary's relation to Jesus as also a model for discipleship. Looking into that and reflecting on that, that empowered her to see her own work and her own witness in those terms, those rather challenging terms of mothering others into life, into Christ-like life. Well, just down the road, in Ivry-sur-Seine, a very troubled and impoverished industrial suburb of Paris, lived my second friend for today's company. Madeleine Delbrêl, D-E-L-B-R-E-L, Madeleine Delbrêl. Rather younger, born in 1904, and again, born into a family totally indifferent to, if not hostile to, the church. Madeleine was an intellectually gifted and creative teenager, and we have some fascinating glimpses from those who knew her as a teenager in the years just after the First World War. She was creative in the sense that she wrote a great deal of poetry and had a national award for one of her early poems. She also, incidentally, liked to design her own clothes. And there are some interesting photographs from her early days which reflect that bit of her personality. She was engaged to another bright young thing in the early 20s. And this bright young thing, who shared her skepticism and her secularism, had a quite unexpected religious conversion and decided that instead of marrying Madeleine, he was going to go off and be a Dominican friar. This was a bit of a shock to Madeleine, as you can imagine. And as sometimes happens with such shocking events, she thought, whatever could it possibly be that drives somebody to become a monk when he could be married to me? She began to explore Christianity, and rather to her own surprise and everybody else's, found that she wanted to be reconciled with the church. And initially, because of what had happened, thought perhaps she ought to be a nun. She lasted really not much more than a few weeks in a Carmelite convent, because rather like Mother Maria, she was the sort of person who wasn't an obvious candidate for the monastic life. And she began to cast around for how she could fulfill a radical Christian vocation in urban France. Fascinatingly, the first community she turned to was the Scouting movement. And she became one of the pioneers of the Girl Guides in France. Again, not a particularly predictable outcome. But what frustrated her in her work with the Girl Guides in France was that you could only go so far with the formation, the spiritual formation of people. And she began to draw together smaller groups of young women who wanted to pray together and reflect together more deeply. And slowly but steadily moved away in the late 20s from the Scouting movement and began to explore a more distinctive kind of apostleship or discipleship in the urban setting. In 1933, she moved to Ivry, that I've mentioned. Ivry, an industrial suburb, lots of activism, left-wing activism, a strongly Marxist local administration, very, very hostile indeed to the Catholic Church. So it seemed very obvious to Madeleine that's where she ought to go. And she writes with obviously mixed feelings about how she was received by the parishioners in Ivry. She said they were wonderful people. They went to church and they got on with it in exemplary ways. The thing was, they might have been living anywhere. They weren't obviously living in Ivry. So she says, no criticism, but I felt I had to live in Ivry, not in the little church enclave. Excellent as it was in many ways, full of lovely people, doing helpful things, but there was another level of identification required. She and her colleagues, who made promises together in a kind of religious order, which never quite became formal, handful of young women at most, the largest, I think it was never more than about 9 or 10 young women, they decided they would simply work in the community. And so she trained as a social worker. And for the rest of her life, until her death in 1964, that was her job. She was a social worker in this industrial suburb. And during the Second World War, she was actually director of social services for Ivry, working for what was still a Marxist and very anti-clerical administration, who had nonetheless recognized that she was bringing to her work something that nobody else was bringing or could bring. And she writes about her work very much in terms of entering into an environment where the hand of God was already at work to give and to teach. She says rather wonderfully that if you're not living in a religious community, your religious superior, the person who tells you what to do in the name of God, is the circumstances you live in. Thank you. Your abbot or mother superior is the circumstances you're living in. So she says, your abbot, your mother superior, is the telephone that rings, the key that won't work, the bus that doesn't come. You are being instructed and formed by God through routine and weather, people who need to kill time or waste time with you. Whatever comes to you is your teacher, your religious superior. And that's one of her most telling images, I think. So that she's not entering into the problems and struggles of the people of Ivry as a Christian who's got the answers to their problems. She's coming to become a Christian through what they give her. And in that exchange, God comes alive in the lives of both. She says, it's very important in our work with, alongside the deprived and the suffering, that we don't simply tolerate them. We don't simply find ways of being kind to them, but we approach them with expectation. We don't tolerate, she says, we await. We don't come to the poor and the deprived saying, oh, well, it's all very messy, but I'll make things better. You come with an expectation. What is God going to unveil in this person or this situation. Bring that expectation. And at least you won't just be bringing your own agenda, your own concerns, your own self-image. You are being shaped by this encounter and by the telephone that rings and the key that doesn't work and the bus that doesn't come. And certainly the records we have from the 30s and 40s do suggest that just as up the road in the Rue de l'Ormel with Mother Maria, domestic circumstances were pretty chaotic at times. And Madeleine had many gifts, but efficient administration probably wasn't at the top of that list. It all has to do with the way in which Madeleine talks about love. Love is something which has to go beyond ideology. Love is something which, as we might say today, has to go beyond culture wars. Love can't be made conditional on anything, on agreement or sympathy or whatever. Love isn't an achievement which we can clock up to our own credit. Love is, well, love is at the end of the day, Christ. Simple as that. And that's where it is so important for our loving action to be grounded in silence and attention. It's silence, she says, that allows us to give ourselves, not, as she puts it, a gift-wrapped version of our own selfishness. Do we want to give ourselves or a gift-wrapped selfishness? And that image of a gift-wrapped selfishness is a wonderful kind of challenge to anyone trying to undertake loving, serving, diaconal, transforming, evangelistic work. Is this about just wrapping up my own need to be loved and admired? Or is it something more? Only the practice of silence can really open the door to giving God's love, not ours. God's love, not ours. And as you can see from that, there is in her a very strong sense indeed that for our love to be transfiguring, it must be a love anchored in Christ, the Christ who is himself only human because he is divine. The way Christ is human is shot through with the gift of God, because Christ, above all, is silent before his Father, allowing all that the Father is to be his own lifeblood and his own gift. And that's the standard to which we are called, to let every moment be a moment where God's love, not ours, is working through. And she writes elsewhere of the fact that we are looking into two different kinds of dark abyss. On the one hand is the depth, the gulf of the world's rejection of God, the injustice, the suffering, and the pain around us. It is an impenetrable darkness. It is a gulf. We can't see the bottom. We can't give any shape to it. And we have to look into that. But the second deep, impenetrable, unsoundable, unfathomable gulf is the abyss of the mysteries of God. And somehow our contemplation has to keep turning between those two deep darknesses. The darkness of the world, looking into that without fear, panic, untruthfulness, and looking into the darkness of God, a darkness which is full of promise, from which arises this love which pours through us. Sorry, this is a very irreverent and irrelevant note, but I can't resist it, I'm afraid. The late Archbishop Anthony Bloom, that great teacher of the faith, who was himself very deeply marked by his contact with Mother Maria in his days in Paris. Archbishop Anthony, when he first came to England, while fluent in Russian and French, was not particularly good in English, and his Russian accent was rather even stronger in those days than it was in his later days. And he's remembered in some quarters for having said that, in a similar image to Madeleine Delbrêl, human life is lived between two huge trembling abysses. The abyss of the world's suffering and the abyss of God's love. But the mental image evoked by two vast trembling abysses, yes, close brackets. But back to her teaching. She is somebody who is profoundly critical of the church's self-referential habits. As we've seen, she can recognize that local Christian congregations can do wonderful work and yet somehow not quite be where people are. She doesn't condemn those who are doing the routine things. She simply says, that's not everyone's calling, and there has to be a calling that takes some people closer to the experience of the gens des rues, the people of the streets. And her best-known book is called Nous les gens de la rue, we, the people of the streets. She doesn't mean street people in the sense of the homeless, she means the average person. We average people. So her attitude to the institutional church is what you might call a friendly distance. She's always very happy to have the cardinal in Paris giving his approval of what she's up to. But she also knows, as any sensible person knows, when to ask and when not to ask permission to do things. Or rather, when to ask permission and when to ask forgiveness. When the worker priest movement began in France, and it was very powerful, of course, in the late 40s and early 50s, she had a lot of sympathy with many of those French priests who were trying to get beyond the subculture, the ghetto of the French priesthood and get out into the streets. At the same time, as we know from her correspondence, she was very cautious about those clergy who thought they simply had to adopt a wholesale Marxist philosophy and a revolutionary program, rather than sharing the love of Jesus. And the two priests who were closest to her, with whom she worked most intently, Father Lorenzo and, oh dear, I've forgotten his name now, Father Loewe. Both of these were in many ways involved with the worker priest movement, both of them very unhappy with the way in which that movement was just a little bit captured by a sort of uncritical French leftist philosophy and rhetoric, to the extent that the life of the sacraments and the life of proclamation and sharing love was a bit sort of sidelined, so it became rather more important to help organize strike committees than to pray. For Madeleine, there shouldn't be an opposition between those two. Woe betide you, though, if you think that organizing the strike committee is a substitute for the silence that allows you to attend, to contemplate, to look as you ought to. And when the worker priest movement was suppressed by the Catholic Church in the early 50s, Madeleine was very indignant on their behalf and wrote some pretty pungent letters to the hierarchy and some articles about this. But she also wrote to some of her more enthusiastic colleagues to encourage them to be more patient with the church. The church, she says, is indeed Mother Church. It is our mother. Mothers are not always right. They're always there. They're not always right. You can't sever the connection with the church because you can't sever your connection with where your life comes from. And then she says to the hierarchy, and if you are speaking for Mother Church, remember your job is to nurture life, not to impose a kind of policing system. So she picks up the sort of cliche, you might say, of Mother Church and directs her fire both at the more irresponsible radicals and at the more authoritarian hierarchy in a way which I find deeply suggestive. And you can see there, again, one of the links that might connect her to Mother Maria. What is motherhood? And the sense also of a love that is a shared life, not just a policy or a set of prescriptions or a set of good deeds. The last thing to note about Madeleine Delbrêl is a phrase which comes in one of her letters, where she's writing about the death of Father Lorenzo, one of the priests, as I said, who was very important for her. And she quotes Father Lorenzo as saying, "Saints have always been people who see. Saints have always been people who see. Les saints étaient des voyants, people who see." And she praises Father Lorenzo in this obituary tribute because he had seen all his work as essentially witness. You're there to point to something. You're not there to clock up results. You're not there to promote bright ideas. You're there to tell people what you've seen. And of course, you won't be able to do that unless you have the discipline of looking in the first place. Right back to where we started. Saints have always been people who see because they are people who discipline themselves to look into the mystery of God in a way that liberates them to look into the mystery of human beings. To look with a depth and a selflessness that allows what then arises to be more than just comforting emotions or admirable acts, but a witness to a deep connection, a unity between what God has made, a unity that God's own work holds together. So I promised at the beginning I would try to flesh out the general point I started with. And I've taken these two remarkable figures, partly because I love both of them so much and owe so much to their teaching, partly because I think they really do show us a model of what, beyond programs and strategies, what mission in a complex urban world might look like in terms of accompaniment, expectation, and that sense that we are always called, first and foremost, to bring the neighbor alive. And because no human being can bring another human being alive in that way, this means opening ourselves to be the channel of God's resurrecting power. God gives life. So if we are to be in any sense agents or catalysts for the transformation, the growth, the sanctification of others, we have to make space for God to be at work, for the love we give to be, as Madeleine says, not ours, but God's. And we are engaged in that task and that discipline out of the conviction that we are always in need of being formed, being fulfilled, being sanctified by God through where we are and through who we're with. The superior, the abbot, is the circumstances, the bus that doesn't come. And for both Mother Maria and Madeleine Delbrêl, there's a profound sense running through all this of the importance of obedience. And that's a bit odd because both of them were extremely self-willed, eccentric, difficult, and evidently rather wonderful people. It sounds as if an evening in the Rue Lormel with Mother Maria, which might end at 3:30 in the morning, after a lot of argument, would be quite tiring. And the sense you have from Madeleine Delbrêl is also that she was a deeply demanding friend. And yet, they're both people who believe that obedience is fundamental. Obedience, not in the sense of snapping to attention at somebody else's command, but obedience in the root sense of the word in Latin, obaudire, listening hard. And the task of the contemplative in mission is listening hard. Listening to God, listening to what's around, looking to God, and being formed by what is seen. The saints have always been people who see. So, thank you for your patience in listening. I hope I've perhaps whetted your appetite just a little to think about these two great women, but also about the vision that they share. And although it's not been drawn out by many people as yet, I think there's a huge amount to be done in bringing those two sets of ideas, practices, perspectives together. Two great saints, two very unconventional saints, two people for whom mission was first and foremost a matter of bringing alive, but who both recognized that you couldn't bring alive unless the life of God was something coming alive in you. And perhaps that is something which we all need to learn as we reflect on the true nature of mission. But maybe that's something you'd want to ask about a bit more as we discuss these figures. And so, time for me to stop, I think. Thank you.